Hello, welcome to Arm Blog Solo. And in our last episode, we talked about the Australian context of anti-politics. Now, anti-politics does have a Marxist theoretical base. It was actually largely explored by Tietze and Elizabeth Humphreys in the 20-teens. Dr. T kind of went off in his own direction after separating from Elizabeth Humphreys. And I'm not going to go into that because this is not a gossip podcast. And I will eventually probably cover some of their older work and some of Elizabeth Humphreys' work for a more explicitly Marxist framework. It's not that Taza has abandoned Marxism, but he does seem to be particularly influenced by the Piping Shrike, who doesn't really seem to have an explicitly Marxist analysis. I also learned, sadly, the Piping Shrike passed away recently, I think in the last 3 years, from this article. I had noticed he quit posting back in 2023, and yeah, unfortunately, he passed away around the 15th of July that year, so he's been gone for about 3 years now. I've done some interviews on Australian politics, not just the most recent one, but also one prior on the referendum that happened around 2023. You can look in my account for that. And I want to talk about that because it's actually a little bit relevant to what we're going to discuss today. So I'm going to focus on the article called Fractured Voice, Fractured Nation by Tietze. It was published in Left Flank in October of 2023. And it analyzes the dynamics around Australia's Indigenous voice to Parliament referendum, which ultimately did not pass. This was written just prior to the vote, and I also have a podcast with an advocate of that piece of legislation or referendum that was done around the same time. So if you want to check that out, that's the one I referred to. Taza frames the near certain failure of the referendum as a symptom of the deeper crisis of the legitimacy of the Australian state and an increasingly detached nature of modern politics from general society, specifically civil society. Now, the distinction between civil and bourgeois society and the state is something that is quite contentious within Marxism. We can see this in Anton Jaeger's hyper-politics as well, which argues that a certain kind of anti-politics actually inverts on itself and becomes hyper-political, even though it doesn't have any political efficacy. My critiques of anti-politics will come out a little bit today, but I do think that there's a real core of truth to what they're talking about the way these broad voter bases have become disconnected from political parties, that the cartel parties and other developments have really made it non-responsive, and that leftists in particular have often not known what to do with this. This co-aligns with my critiques of populism, but that the anti-political nature of a lot of populist appeal, not the politicians who are populist themselves, who can only try to ride the wave of an anti-political sentiment, leads me to think that, to use Deng's famous quote about Mao and Mao's famous quote about Stalin, like 25% right, 25% wrong, 75% right, or something accordingly. That's not the right ratio. So that actually is what I would say is true in these anti-political writings, because I think the base of what they're describing is real. I think they just bracket out some things that I would not bracket out, and we'll get to that. But let's talk about this particular piece from 3 years ago, and I do think we have to put ourselves back in a mindset of after some reckonings in the United States seem to have led to reckonings elsewhere abroad, as well as colonial reckonings in New Zealand, specifically led to a referendum to undo Section 51 of the Australian Constitution, which is known as the heads of power clause, where the Commonwealth Parliament has the authority to make laws. The specific subsection is section 51 XSVI, so 26, which is the race powers clause. And you need to understand that to understand what the referendum was actually about. Tietze argues that the fundamental paradox of the voice proposal was that it sought to solve the Indigenous problem while leaving most of the racially discriminatory elements of the Australian Constitution intact. Specifically, it would have preserved Section 51, the Race Powers Act, which historically underpinned the White Australia policy and has been used for both positive reforms like native title and negative interventions like the Northern Territory intervention. The voice was designed from a top down by a small group of constitutional lawyers and elite Aboriginal leaders, at least according to Dr. Tad, and I can't really say one way or the other if he's wrong about the nature of who those leaders were. Particularly the 2017 Uluru dialogues that were heavily curated and not particularly grassroots, at least according to Dr. T. Its purpose was to give Indigenous leaders a permanent seat at the table to advise on how the state utilizes its race-related powers. But because the voice depended on the concept of indigeneity, defined partly by blood ancestry, and this was absorbed into the sole sovereign framework of the state, the Yes campaign struggled to convince itself that it was an anti-racist, democratic, unifying advancement, even though it was totally dependent on blood notions of race, which themselves were colonial. I mean, we haven't seen such referendum in the United States, but many attempts to handle racism in the United States are also based on fundamentally racist legal assumptions. So it doesn't particularly surprise me as an analogy to here. Although I do want to be clear that we don't have the same kinds of referendum process on the federal level for the most part. The failure of the referendum, according to Dr. T, would trigger a major shakeup within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander political class. Elite leaders such as Noel Peterson staked everything on this constitutional permanence, famously declaring there was no plan B. I've heard many such declarations in the past that almost never goes well. Ironically, the push for a singular voice occurred when Indigenous representation in the federal parliament was at an all-time high, with 11 separate Indigenous MPs. The Yes campaign ended up attacking dissenting Indigenous political figures as well, such as Jacinta Napijimpa Price on the right and Lydia Thorpe on the left, who refused to support a single state sanctioned body. Ultimately, the failure to consolidate Indigenous political opinion under one constitutional umbrella means that the deeply fractured, diverse, and fragmented nature of Indigenous politics is now out in the open. Thus, elite representation within the Indigenous community cannot speak for the entire community itself. Now, I have seen that many times in the United States, particularly around Indigenous activists who often have vastly more progressive, liberal, or even Marxist-Leninist opinions than you'd find on any poll polling the res, where there was both hostility to the federal government, completely understandably, and maybe some nascent notions of class consciousness, but often a hostility to most progressive forms of politics as being seen as too urban and not really representing Indigenous interest, which are often just more rural. The politics of a lot of reses tend to be actually fairly Republican, ironically, in the United States. Now, I don't know how this shakes out in the Indigenous community in Australia, and I won't deign to speak to it. It wasn't totally in the purview of the article at hand. So this leads to a couple of different things, ironically, according to Dr. T, some of which I think we really do need to deal with. And I think one of the things that he contests here is that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and the Labour Party were largely out of sync with the broad political sentiment in Australia, and that the rejection of the referendum may not have actually proven deep-seated racism. It also doesn't disprove it. It doesn't cut either way, according to Dr. T. Labor attempted to wedge a coalition, the coalition opposition, by framing the voice as a modest, polite request that only reactionaries would reject. The strategy backfired, which turned the referendum into a hyper-partisan issue. Hyper-politics comes up again. Labor expected voters to blindly trust politicians and major corporate and civil institutions, such as Qantas, the big banks, and a lot of unions, to guide the moral choice. However, because public trust in these institutions was steadily eroded for decades for a variety of reasons, institutional banking became a poison chalice in and of itself. Furthermore, by withholding the exact policy details of how the voice would operate, the government alienated working class and traditional labor voters who were more preoccupied with the immediate and deep cost of living crisis in Australia, which mirrors the cost of living crisis in all the Anglophone countries, and I think most of continental Europe too. I know that's true. I know that it's actually a crisis in Scandinavia to some degree, and there's a very acute one in Ireland, UK, Canada. I cannot speak, however, to the rest of continental Europe, and I won't deign to. I've had to say that twice. Anyway, Tietze draws parallels between the voice referendum and in the UK's Brexit fallout. Out of bitterness, prominent Yes campaigners began labeling a no vote as a product of base racism or sheer stupidity. I actually do think a lot of the Brexit vote was sheer stupidity, but not for the reasons that a lot of progressives did, and not because I would have supported staying in the EU. It's that the structural problems of the English economy were hidden by a sweetheart deal made with the EU that did still hurt workers, but that once that was removed, the public voice had to deal with the fact that they didn't understand the situation that their country was in and how much their country was already completely dependent on finance capital. And I do think missing that analysis puts things into a bit more stark option. Basically, my take on Brexit is there was no good way to handle the situation until other things were handled first. But as far as it goes, I do think you have to deal with the fact that the public was not really in understanding of what was at stake, and that progressives in England were not really being honest about the situation. Tietze warns about the elitist narrative, accusing public moral failure because they voted against the establishment, which mirrors Hillary Clinton's baskets of deplorable trope, which has hardly ever worked. You still see progressives try to pull this in America, although it's become slightly less common. It is common amongst people in a certain age cohort, generally younger Gen Xers and older millennials, who still hold on to this narrative pretty hard. So rather than healing national divides, the campaign exacerbated a deep structural rift between self-absorbed political class and a very fractious electorate. Now, my critique of this anti-political analysis is only that it pretty much lacks deep class analysis. It does have some. I'm not going to say it doesn't have any. But that's where things really become a little bit more interesting to me, because I don't think it's this division of the bases and this anti-political sentiment is really totally explainable without dealing with the way the Anglophone world class development has headed, which is formal proletarianization for lots of society, but with massive income and opportunity differences within the proletariat itself, or the working class itself. Use the word that you would choose. I know there's some debate about whether or not all workers are proletarian, but I think it becomes relatively clear that a lot of the distrust is aimed at workers as much as anything else. Now, I'm actually not particularly interested in healing national divides in a lot of these countries because I think they exist for reasons beyond just mere partisanship, to be quite frank. But maybe I'm an odd man out there. So I want to talk about this. The piping strike and Tietze share a pretty distinct intellectual architecture. Tietze comes from a Trotskyist tradition in Australia. And he became interested in anti-politics around the time of the Arab Spring, and this developed into a kind of broader analysis with elites in general in the late 2010s and then through COVID. The Rabble Report, which I've had on my show, has talked about this a lot too, and we share a lot of frameworks, although I have critiqued them for having a somewhat class collaborationist view of a unified civil society, and that they tend to think that the politics has sucked the life out of civil society, particularly post-COVID, where I think that the economy has sucked the life out of civil society, going all the way back to the 1970s. But let's go over the key terms and remind you of some of the stuff that came up in the piping strike videos. When examined through any kind of Marxist perspective, these three essays move past standard economic critique. And in fact, I think that they're pretty good about that, but also that's part of their limitation. This is one of the times where your virtue and your vice are almost the same thing. They do read to have somewhat sophisticated undergirding applications of political theory, even some Marxist political theory, general state theory, and views from Gramscian hegemony that align with specific historical currents within the Marxist tradition, but are not necessarily only Marxist. Now, Tietze does come out of a Marxist tradition. I have no idea if the piping strike does. I tend to doubt it, given the way he talked. But nonetheless, if someone knows more about his particular background, I'd love to be informed. I've read quite a few of his essays because my friend Joseph Sorrentino suggested them to me on one of his visits to the show. And I will have Joseph back on probably in August if I can get him for a joint stream between our two podcasts to talk a little bit more about the piping strike pieces, not just the two that we talked about in that video earlier this week. Okay, so let's talk about some key themes we can see in all these anti-political essays. One is that we have a hollowed out social base where traditional political parties, once built on organic social groups, even if those organic social groups had to curtail themselves in the party, organized workers backing labor parties, corporate and agrarian interests backing conservatives, kind of leading to party collapse. Unlike in the past, when these parties collapsed, like they did in the 19th century, when the representation away, see sharecroppers in the fall of the Populist Party in the United States, you start seeing some real problems. And now we've seen the decline of union density across the English-speaking world. America is where it's most acute, but it's everywhere in the English-speaking world and most of continental Europe too. Parties no longer represent bottom-up social weight. They exist as elite, self-perpetuating apparatuses that have essentially become cartels. And they like using ideological blinkers that many of the rest of society found alien as a way to sort people. This leads, according to all these essays, to an inversion of representation. Through representation, where a class or any other coherent subject, frankly, puts forward derogates accountable to them, has replaced by top-down branding. Elite claims to legitimacy based on looking like society, diversity quotas, and identity markers are still elite insofar that they represent relatively elite groups with the access to social and literal capital to get long internships, things like that enable them to better function in politics. So these people have their own interest, and while they claim to represent people, they don't really emerge from a base which can discipline them. And I make a lot of points about this on my show, actually, from a game theoretic standpoint or from a Marxist standpoint, but we see this here from this anti-political standpoint too. So thus, parties don't act as a conduit for material interests of the general public. In fact, they expect the general public to conform to them. And that's not just liberals. Look at Trump whining about both his base and any deviation from his key figurehood in the entire apparatus of the Republican Party. This leads to an increasing representation of the state apparatus because the political class lacks any mass mandate for much of anything. It views the public's actual choices, whether they be Brexit, Trump, the no vote on Australian political referendum, as an unpredictable threat and as a threat to democracy, while also advocating for non-democratic elements of the state in particular, such as the executive administrative apparatus, which has been weaponized by Trump now anyway, so maybe they'll stop doing that. The judiciary, which progressives put up until the last decade here in America, and again, see weaponization and realization of how much power they've allowed to fall into the Supreme Court's hands without pushback since the 1940s, really. So state parliamentary procedures and media bureaucracies are weaponized to filter, manage, and override public will. Now, I don't care about the public will particularly. I want to be clear about that. But I do find it very ironic that people who supposedly care about broad spectrum democracy are afraid of the public will this thoroughly and see the public will as anti-democratic in and of itself. That's a problem. So let's talk about the connections this anti-political thinking may have to different forms of Marxism. One, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels famously wrote that the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie, or the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, which I think feels very true in America right now, but feels true pretty much in everywhere where there is such an executive. Maybe not in China, in Cuba in particular, but everywhere else. These essays illustrate a hypermodern version of this, I think. The Piping Strike article, Politics of the Looking Glass, that we discussed in the last Varn Solo episode, argues that reform has been redefined from giving the public what it wants by structurally rearranging society to forcing unpopular economic and or social policies onto a resistant public by fiat or administrative privilege. Now, this aligns pretty clearly with the classical Marxist view of the state, because the political class wants that power partly to manage things for elite business interests or for their donor class. When political parties lose their organic ties to the working class, or to the working class in particular, because it's the largest singular class in the developed world, they revert to their baseline function, which is to manage the state apparatus to preserve the conditions for capitalist accumulation, regardless of what voters actually desire and how they meet those desires. This brings us to Gramsci and the way Gramscian crisis, which Elizabeth Humphreys explicitly ties to anti-politics. I don't know if Tietze does. I'm sure Dr. T can tell me. He knows who I am. So these essays lean heavily into concepts popularized by Gramsci, particularly the analysis of an organic crisis, which itself is an elaboration on Lenin's objective and subjective crises aligning. Gramsci argued that when the ruling class maintains power not just through force, but through hegemony and cultural and political assent, organized through the rest of civil society, unions, political parties, organizations that are aligned with the status quo. An organic crisis occurs when the social base detaches itself from traditional parties and their various social and civil authority mechanisms, leaving the ruling class with power, but with no general or even genuine moral or intellectual leadership. Gramsci uses the term passive revolution to describe how elites absorb threats from below by adopting the symbols of progress without changing structural power. This is where all the symbolic manipulation of politics comes from, and Gramsci's pretty clear on it. The critique of gender and ethnic diversity in cabinets and the voice to the parliament referendum fits this view perfectly. The state tries to achieve moral legitimacy by changing the appearance of diversity while leaving the underlying structures of state power and economic exploitation completely untouched, even racialized ones. Like I said, the increase in diversity and Black representation in elite institutions has actually corresponded particularly starkly with a stagnation of Black wealth over the last 20 years, at least since the Great Recession. Gramsci notes when hegemony cracks, elites resort to legalism, bureaucracy, public shaming, demagoguery, pretty much whatever they can get their hands on, laboring dissenting voters from irrational to deplorable to outright terrorists to hold on to power. This is a subjective crisis of elites. Now, again, this goes back to Lenin. Lenin talks about this, both the subjective and objective crises and their effects on the two primary contending classes, the capitalists and their political class elites, and the workers and their various institutions. And in fact, for Lenin, you need objective crisis in both fields and a subjective crisis in both fields to start to even begin to look like anything like a revolutionary possibility is happening. We can also talk about open Marxism and the critique of the capitalist state form. Open Marxism associated with theorists like John Holloway and Simon Clark, two people I'm particularly fond of. I didn't like where open Marxism ended up, but I did like where they started, and I tend to be particularly partisan for the work of the late Simon Clark and for John Holloway, which focus heavily on how the state structures itself as an alienated form of social relations. It rejects the idea that socialists can simply capture the capitalist state and use it for good. Basically, another reason to foreclose on simple reformism, because the state's very layout is designed to separate politics from the economy, and to do so by legal fiat, thus making it nearly impossible for political reforms to be very deep unless they're in favor of the capitalist class. Tietze's critique of the voice of parliament embodies something like this framework too. He argues that as the voice was a top-down proposal designed by constitutional lawyers to embed a specific form of indigenous politics directly into the state apparatus, specifically using the inherently discriminatory race power of the Constitution, which was originally used, for racist purposes, frankly. This shows that there's a fundamental fear of building up this social acceptance in old-fashioned ways. From an open Marxist perspective, this is an understandable trap. By trying liberation through a permanent advisory body within a capitalist state, it ensures radical social demands are safely housed, trained, professionalized, recuperated, and subjected to the state's authority. AKA, just like the NCLB made labor unions a lot more compliant to state fiat, so might the voice to the parliament for indigenous politics. Now, I have entertained arguments on this very show to the contrary, and I am not saying that I have a strong feeling about what should have been done one way or the other, but how it was done seems to be a particular failure of top-down politics, of which some leftists sided with the top-down politics. Then there's a kind of analogous to the Miliband-Palancas state debate, which was the institutionalization institutional instrumentalism debate versus structuralism debate. This famous debate focuses on Ralph Miliband, the father of the former labor PM that everyone forgets existed, who argued that the state serves the ruling class because elites share the same social networks, background, and elite schools. Basically, they share a habitus, and this actually provides the function for the state, but this is all instrumental. And then thus, this can be altered by taking a state and then having those other alternative social networks at hand. Nicholas Poliancis argued that the state is structured to save capitalism from itself, even legally, meaning that it can remain relatively autonomous from individual capitalist and individual capital and sectoral interest, but it does so to keep the whole system stable. The Piping Strike essays show that modern Western states, particularly in the Anglophone sphere, have lost their Poliancis-style relative autonomy because parties no longer have to balance the messy competing demands of mass working class membership and responses to it. They have become entirely cartelled and insular. The state apparatus has become purely instrumental, not just to individual billionaires, but to an insular cross-partisan managerial class who look out for their own survival above all else. I actually tend to think that Poliancis is probably more right than Miliband, but this is what the Piping Strike is arguing. So we have to ask ourselves, these essays arrive at a conclusion that mirrors Marx's ultimate critique of politics, which that the state cannot solve the problems created by society and its mode of production. And while Zoran Mamdani might be talking about the need for good government and good government as a transition for this, and many social democrats can feel emboldened about this while they've gotten a few reforms that pit against years and years of neoliberalism, the austerity is written on the wall and it will come for them. Furthermore, it's just not true that most of the government, even when it is run competently, can be run in people's interests if those interests are at odds with the overriding profit motive of society. And I just think that it is naive to pretend that any socialist politician can overcome these by balancing a government through reamortization or by providing some mild social welfare reforms like the possibility of universal daycare and some government subsidized grocery stores. And I said government socialized because apparently they are not completely owned by the New York City government. By framing democracy not as a set of rules managed by Westminster or Washington, but as an actual movement of society asserting itself against a material will, this also suggests that the current crack-up cannot be fixed just by better political manners or smarter constitutional design or even a very good socialist mayor. For a Marxist, and even for most anti-politicos, the crisis persists because the political superstructure and the relations of production in the base have completely outlived the social base that gave those superstructural functions any sort of meaning. And I want to be very clear on this. I do not think the superstructure is completely separated from the base because relations of production are actually defined by things superstructural. And this is an almost yin-yang-like development that is often left out of most models of Marxism. But anyway, while the anti-politics and the Marxist-adjacent frameworks by writers like the Piping Strike and Tietze offer a powerful and highly conceited critique of modern elite institutions, there are some things we'd have to look at that point out some significant, perhaps logical flaws and some blind spots and maybe some misreadings. By filtering all modern political life into the single lens of the attached elite versus betrayed public, these analyses tend to oversimplify how society actually functions, and they also are inherently class collaborationists in doing so. First of all, they give in to the fallacy of the pure public, which is a populist logic, and you know how I feel about populism since I co-wrote a book with Daniel Tutt about how much I dislike it. The most glaring logical issue across these essays is reliance on a binary and seemingly romanticized view of the public or even the working class, which again only Tietze really deals with, given his Marxist priors. The authors structurally treat the public as a unified, coherent entity that has a clear, singular will that is being suppressed by elites. That's the way they talk. In reality, the public is deeply fractured along lines of geography, education, culture, race, and most specifically, class and strata divisions. Now, I think strata divisions are important, and there's something even Marxists lately have been hesitant to deal with. This kind of leads to a nearly circular argument, though. When the public votes no and the voice are yes to Brexit, the authors frame it as a pure expression of bottom up democratic defiance. However, if the public votes for an establishment figure or policy, this framework logically struggles to explain it without inventing a conspiracy. Our selectively ignoring outcomes are pretending that certain political actors are somehow anti political when they just rode the winds of anti political sentiment. And this latter thing has been a debate that I've had with Tietze and even Joe and Grant in the past. Now, I like Joe and Grant's work. That's Joseph Sorrentino, who's come on the show, and Grant, both of their Alba report. And I think, like I said, this is about 80% correct, but that it really does see democracy as a nearly homogeneous public that just works itself out in a clear way. Now, I do think what they're right about is elites don't trust the public and they don't trust the working class either. But if, when they vote against something that is establishment, it represents anti-politics, but when they vote for something that is establishment, it doesn't represent any anti-political will. This is actually a circular argument. So I think the other thing we have to do is talk about the causes of union decline, because this actually plays into both a lot of Marxist understandings and some of these anti-political things that I might be critical of. Elites didn't just walk away from unions. The authors often imply that political elites deliberately abandoned their working class base to become detached managers, although I would say the piping strike is actually a little bit more astute than this. But he doesn't go into why it happened. He just says that it happened, and thus I can't really contest his mechanism because it isn't offered in the essays I talked about. Decline of unions and mass political parties was driven by massive systemic social economic shifts, particularly the transition from industrial manufacturing to service knowledge economies in the developed world. Industrial manufacturing having higher organic rates of capital, thus high rates of fixed capital, and thus lots of automation. Urbanization and the commodification of open free spaces made not so open and not so free anymore, basically the enclosures of everything, and the rise of a consumer culture that is hyper individualized, since commodity purchasing and owning is one of the few ways that you can participate in society in this form capitalist state. The political past didn't just decide to leave society behind. Deindustrialization and fragmentation meant that there was no mass base to be had. And while the piping strike does talk about this, they also, if you read Tietze, there seems to be this hope that you can organically put this back together, ironically, through some kind of political will towards leaving civil society alone. But civil society is deeply fractured because the economic base of civil society is deeply fractured. And this is something I've been arguing, against the anti-politicals for years. In fact, that's my main point of disagreement with them. I think that they are, mostly right. And I want to be clear about this. They're not going to agree with me on this because they seem to think that politics is what's fractured society. And I think that's kind of ludicrous. Society was already fractured because its economic base was no longer stable. Service sector economy and service inflation and a bunch of other issues meant that clear, large, easily organized blocks just didn't exist for the unions to take over. And we see that today anyway. Logically, the biggest critique of anti-political analysis is that it functions purely as an autopsy. It is highly effective at diagnosing when something is broken, but it doesn't really provide a way forward because it doesn't really go into why it is broken other than a disconnect between political elites and civil society. By dismissing internal party reforms as hollow legalism, by dismissing constitutional adjustments as top-down traps, by dismissing minor parties as elite-threatening kaleidoscopes, the authors close off most actual mechanisms of modern political change. And since they don't deal with the economic disparities, they don't really deal with economic civil ways to deal with it either. If all existing political forms are inherently corrupted by the state apparatus or by political elites, the only logical conclusion left is a total systemic collapse or a spontaneous or an organized mass revolution with no political representation whatsoever. Both are basically eschatology. Because the latter is highly unlikely in even unstable Western democracies, much less stable ones, the analysis ultimately leads to a cynical dead end with no real political solutions or even anti-political solutions. These essays excel at describing the feeling of modern political alienation and why modern mass party politics can't manifest in the current cartel parties, but their reliance on an elite quasi-populist elites versus the people binary causes them to mistake chaotic, fragmented, and highly complex media and economic shifts for a simple betrayal of democracy. Now, I know Tietze actually has a more complicated view of all this, but it doesn't come off in many of the writings I've read, particularly after 2019. So, to rescue anti-politics from a lot of these cul-de-sacs, we have to move past diagnosing the rift between elites and the public alone. We need to upgrade the theory so it doesn't rely on a romanticized unified people, which I think Marxists should not do anyway. I cannot stand when people talk about the masses are the people without really going into what the fuck they mean. Marx particularly had it out for the people, but if you want to talk about the masses, you need to define who counts. It's not everyone. Nor do we want to collapse into pure cynicism, or aka nihilism. Now, I think cynical analysis is necessary even of your allies, which is why I'm not necessarily coming down softly on all of anti-politics, even though, like I said, I think it's pretty deep about the distrust of democracy and why political elites feel that way. But I don't think it really goes into how this happened deep enough. So one thing we need to look up is what has happened in the sociology of fragmentation. The decline of mass institutions, unions, churches, etc., didn't leave behind a unified working class waiting for a vanguard or a mass plebiscite waiting to be manifested if it was just given the proper referendum, or even a way to totally opt out of politics. It shattered society into a kaleidoscope of atomized microcultures, shifting interest groups and algorithmic echo chambers precisely because the economic base was itself so fragmented. Services are often alienated from each other. They're in direct competition for each other. And even though I do consider them part of the proletariat, unlike a few very strict Marxists, I don't think that we can say that they have clear organizable interests in the same way that were easily manifested in working class politics and in union struggles in the early 20th century. So instead of framing the crisis as elites versus the people, which is just a populist framework, which anti-politics is almost guilty of rebranding, we should think about it as a bureaucratic state versus a hyper-pluralist society. A society that is already deeply fragmented because the economic base of that society has fragmented for a long time. The state's 19th century machinery is failing because it was built to manage a stable, largely republic-based, and I mean that in a Michael Sandel sense of small communities, that developed in time into massive but predictable social blocks. It literally doesn't know how to process a society made of fluid, hyper-individualized identities and networks, even though it does try to manage them through identity representation. To get back to that means we need to understand how working class politics itself has become fragmented and what we can do about it, or what counter tendencies in capitalism we could use to undo capitalism in this fragmentation. And I don't think that's easy to do, but it's something that we have to do if we don't want to get stuck LARPing eternally, or just getting into the 99% versus the 1% nonsense and anti-political nonsense, because the anti-political manifestation ends up being solely basically a distrust of all institutions eventually. And there's good reason to distrust the institutions. I'm not like a we can show them we can do good government kind of guy, because I'm not sure you really can. The class interests of the vast majority of the population and the state are never going to completely align. Another thing we can start thinking about is the way class and identity could be synthesized. I used to try to call this materialist intersectionality. I even gave a speech on it about 10 years ago in Idaho, and I wrote about it in my response to Mark Fisher's Vampire Castle speech. I said that intersectionality had been watered down by standpoint epistemology and other things that come out of Marxism but have been highly liberalized, and that have been used to have shallow representation, ignore deep structural divisions within identity groups. And while intersectionality is supposed to analyze this, going back to Kimberly Crenshaw's initial work in the 1980s and her critical legal theory, it got co-opted itself by once making intersectionality kind of a vague term for united colors of Benetton solidarity. We need to acknowledge that the fight for racial or gender justice begins as a general bottom-up material struggle that manifests in the contradictions of the working class itself. Since it is a contradiction of the working class itself, it is easily manipulated by elites and capitalist powers, because it's easily manipulated by elites and capitalist powers since it's an organic, real contradiction in the working class. You don't believe me? Look at using black people to scab on white workers that increased racism, which then led white workers to not form solidarity unionism with black people in the South, which led to the Appalachian line, where unions didn't really have any power below the Appalachia. Basically, they lost a struggle at Blair Mountain. This is something that Daniel Tutton and I both really talk about in our book, The People Are Not One, that is coming out. It might be even out by the time I release this, to be honest with you. You can no longer insult marginalized groups by calling their struggles fake. You need to figure out where representation of elites and those marginalized groups has overridden the general marginalized group's overall interest, and work from there. Most of those people in those groups are working class, and their tensions with people who have different kinds of privileges within the working class do need to be dealt with, but in a way that brings people together in solidarity, not pushes them apart as simple fucking racist. You need to demonstrate how to start uses the real struggles to give itself a progressive makeover while changing nothing about the economic exploitation. See Black representation increasing and the Black economic position in the United States being stagnant effectively since the Great Recession. And this was particularly ironic given we had our first Black president. We also need to account for technology and network power. Traditional Marxists, unfortunately, and anti-political theorists were built for the print and television eras. At least that's their understanding of how these politicians understood things. When information flowed through highly centralized gatekeepers, modern anti-politics is grounded in digital sociology, and the anti-politicals know that, but they don't really have a way to handle that fragmentation. The crack up isn't just a political crisis, it's also a communication crisis. The internet allows for massive, horizontal, lightning-fast self-organization that completely bypasses political parties, but not platform gatekeepers, meaning it actually increases capitalist power while decreasing institutional power. An improvement to this framework would recognize the political class as insular, partly out of its own self-defense, which I don't think anti-politicals would even argue with. They are trapped in the slow-moving legacy institutions that really have a hard time dealing with fast-moving information cycles and are desperately trying to build algorithmic filters out of chaotic, unmanageable noise of network-driven public life, which has been largely enclosed by various capitalist actors. I also think you have to start thinking about what civil counterpower would look like, and I think it would look like a modern dual power, but that dual power will not look like what Lenin was talking about in in the early USSR or in the Tsarist Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So there needs to be civil institutions that can interface with political institutions and even act to build up ways to replace them. That is not easy to do in the current environment, and I'm not saying that you can just will it to be, because that itself would be kind of LARPing. Instead of staring at Parliament and complaining that it doesn't represent us, or Congress for that matter, an advanced anti-political framework married with a Marxist framework would ultimately start looking at where we can build counter institutions that are sustainable. The problem that we have is focusing primarily on electoralism to build those up ties us to the very state and funding infrastructures that we want to at least reform, if not abolish. I don't think there's an easy out for that, but I think it's what we have to do. Now, I don't think my friends over at the Rabble Report or Dr. Tad would necessarily take a whole lot of issue with what I've said here, even though I've been slightly critical of their overly populist frameworks. But I do think the crisis of political elites is important because it represents fragmentations of capitalism itself. I just don't have a voluntaristic answer of returning to civil society as an answer, because civil society's fragmentation is why I think this happened in the first place, not the other way around. I do think, however, a lot of leftists and Marxist commentators should have more faith in their class to be anti-racist in practice, if not symbolically. I realize that you're going to have a lot of non-woke statements from people who aren't educated in the sociological codes of professionals, academics, and media elites. But I do think we have to deal with the fact, and which trickle down throughout all of society and outside of elite circles, they do. But I do think we have to deal with the fact that a lot of the grievances that undergird those linguistic justice issues, symbolic mediation, etc., are real and substantive. And if we don't handle them, we're kind of fucked. I hope this gets you interested in an anti-political framework. I will come back to this relatively soon to talk about this more. I'm going to look at some more of Dr. T's work as well as his former partner, Elizabeth Humphreys, to kind of get how we might think about this in a more Marxist or even, Marxist centrist, slightly Marxist leftist centrist point of view. And by Marxist center, I just mean those of us who are partyist, who are not completely anti-electoral, but think that most forms of electoral reformism are kind of doomed. And I know that seems like a contradiction, which maybe I should explain to people eventually. But nonetheless, as I've said in the past, I consider myself the far left of the Marxist center, meaning I have many opinions informed by years of debate with left communists and other people who are considered ultra-left, anarchists, and whatnot, but ultimately do agree that we must deal with the state and political forms as they currently exist to create leverage to start to undo them. Anything else is basically waiting forever, or waiting for capitalism to collapse in on itself and do the work for us. And on that note, protect your peace, like and subscribe, hit the bell. You'll find more behind the Patreon wall, which you can get access for as little as $4. I have some Patreon shout outs. I haven't done these in a while, and I apologize for that. So let's get that done. The following are my $10 or more patrons, which I call the Kani Kahanans, which is my obnoxiously Mongol horde themed way of referring to the people who give me the most money. Anyway, They currently include the following four newbies: free beer to Mr. W. I don't know what that means, but I appreciate it. Drea, Lucas P, and Philip M. Thank you so much for your support. All right. Take care.